Well, welcome to the show. Today, I have a special guest who I first saw on Anarchast some time ago, and then somewhat recently he interviewed me for his show, and now he's willing to come on and have just a fun chat with me. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you so much, Shepard. It's great to be with you today.
So, is your podcast? It is called the White Pillbox. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes,
One
that's the name.
Wonderful. And I absolutely love your positive attitude. I love that you are a normal person who is bright, and I don't see a bunch of tattoos or the marijuanas or the tie dye. And it seems like you're just a normal, productive, normal human being. So thanks for being that guy. That it seems that the people who
You're
speak
welcome.
out in our movement aren't always that. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you're welcome for being you, right?
That's right. No problem. That's easy.
So the reason that I wanted to chat with you is you have this awesome something like 30 part or 20 something part
23.
series,
Yes. Yeah.
23 part series on the myth of authority. And you have a particularly wonderful spin on it. And I wanted to get more deeply into some things, but for those who have never heard of such a thing, will you give me your elevator pitch, your 1 or 2 minute synopsis of what is the myth of authority?
Sure. Well, the myth of authority is this notion that sits in the minds of virtually everyone that political rulers are our moral leaders, that we are morally obligated to obey their rules, and that that is a legitimate condition, that we are supposed to follow what they say, and that we're a bad person if we don't. It is a deference of our own internal moral intuitions and basically abdicating that in favor of whatever political leaders exist at the time. I call it a myth because I consider it false. I consider it false that we are obligated to obey the moral dictates of others and defer our own morality to them. That, in a nutshell, is what I consider the myth of authority.
Okay, wonderful. And I was first introduced to this idea of the myth of authority in the book, The Most Dangerous Superstition by Larken
Yes.
Rose. And I know you're also familiar with that. You've been a critical thinker. I call it a critical thinker. Some people call it anarchism. Some people call it voluntarism. I don't know what everybody has a different name, but how long have you been a critical thinker? Or has it been a lifelong thing, or did you have an aha moment?
Practically lifelong. I got red pilled, as we say, at about 18 or 19 years old. I was just lucky enough to come across uh, the right people that were already themselves thinking along these lines, anarchism, voluntarism, whatever you want to call it. And it made sense to me. I was lucky enough not to have been really raised in an overly political family. My parents, they had their opinions, but it just wasn't something that was talked about much. So at that age, I really didn't have a lot of uh, strong indoctrination to get over, and certainly not at 18, 19 years old, not much life experience to have formed strong political opinions. So when I was exposed to the ideas of liberty, of self-government, let's say, uh, it was fairly easy for me. So I didn't really have a tough time getting out of that. And I've been what I would consider a voluntarist anarchist ever since. So that's not quite 50 years, but it's getting close to 50 years for me.
Okay, okay. It occurs to me that a good way of defining what it is that you and I, where our Venn diagram circles intersect, that area that we share, is that voluntarism, or this idea that we should not initiate violence against others or their property, and that they ought not initiate violence against us or our property. And when I say violence, that's kind of the bumper sticker version of saying, don't steal my stuff, don't defraud me. So a lot of things fall under that. But that's kind of the breakdown. And I think most of us in the critical thinking movement are we target the state, the government, and we say that entity is the bad guy. How do we tear down that bad guy, or how do we undermine it, etc. But you have a different idea. And what is that?
Well, we don't like the state, and the reason we don't like it is because it is essentially a big thug. It's a big mafia, and we know that because the rules and requirements that they enforce are enforced without consent. They violate consent. If someone doesn't want to pay their taxes, there really isn't a choice about that. They must do it. That's what a thug does. He points a gun at you and he says, "Give me your money or else." That's the or else of the state in all of its regulations, taxes, and so on. We recognize that, and as principled people, we apply what we would apply to a thug or to a mafia to everyone and every institution, and that would include the state. If what the state's doing is so important, they ought to be able to do it by asking us to voluntarily contribute or participate. So we recognize this as a bad institution. And traditionally, the movement, the libertarian, anarchist, voluntarist movement, has, as you said, focused on that because that's a clear, tangible, real world concept that we can get our heads around. And so we hate that thing. With with thinking like Larken Rose's most dangerous superstition and other contributors, but very much so in his case, he consolidated the idea that, well, wait a minute, this bad thing has to have a root cause. And so by peeling back the layers, we discover that the root cause of an institution like that existing and persisting is the myth of political authority, the idea that it's okay for an institution like that to exist as a coercive, consent violating unit. And so knowing that we have the knowing that we have the root cause of the state identified, now you would think it would shift our thinking to say, well, if we're going to strategize to make things better, perhaps attacking or addressing the symptom, the state, might not be as efficient as if we try to address the cause, the myth. So that's really the big insight of the shift in thinking in terms of how you might want to direct your efforts toward changing things for the better.
That makes good sense. And it's so, once we think about it, it's so intuitive, but it doesn't seem that it pops up as being obvious. It's like the guy walking up and his intent is to kill you. He comes storming up to you, reaches down, grabs a stick, and then we, as critical thinking, principled people, we say, we hate sticks. Well, the
Right.
stick isn't the problem. And if we get rid of the stick, there's still a big bad guy who wants to hurt us. And that seems to me that it's that myth that I run the thought experiment. If we could snap our fingers and get rid of all of the, I love the term you use, bullies. And among the bullies, there are the suits, you call them, and there are the enforcers. If we could get rid of all the suits and all of the enforcers with a snap of the finger, and I don't mean kill them. That's not, I mean, armed confrontation isn't my thing. Let's say that we could snap our fingers. They all retired to a beautiful island and didn't have contact to spread their bad ideas back to the rest of us. It's not going to change anything. That
Right.
is such a realization that there are so many more people waiting to come back and take their positions and to if, the backfill, the vacuum, or whatever it is. Why is that just a human condition, or why is that?
Well, it's because what we see in front of us is more tangible and obvious, and the obvious is right in front of us. And peeling back the layers takes a little bit of thinking. And so, right, if I'm coughing a lot, I might think, well, I might have a cold or have something stuck in my throat. And if it persists for 6 months, now there's an indication that, there could be something else going on. But if all I'm doing is taking cough medicine, I'm really not addressing the problem if it persists. And it would take effort. It would take some skill and equipment to realize, oh, there's a cancer in my lung. And that is why I was coughing. And now at that point, you might say, okay, I got a cancer in my lung. Yeah. Oh, well, I'm glad I identified that. Well, back to the cough drops. That's what the libertarian movement is doing and has done for as long as I've been aware of it. It's gone back to that symptom and saying, yeah, we really don't like that symptom. And even I would say most, from what I can tell, most from what most commentators who are aware of the myth of authority as the root have done is basically that. They've said, yeah, I get it. I know the myth of authority is the root of the state. Got it. I'm going to go back now, and attack the state and deal with the state. For whatever reason, conceptualizing, internalizing that seems to be difficult. Maybe because, as I said, the state you can see, the myth you can't see it. You have to conceptualize it and internalize it. That's the best I could do to explain why we don't see more efforts in that direction.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm going to go back to what I kind of said part of the punchline about bullies and such. You break down the population, and I think of the United States. I don't know that you're addressing the world, but of the United States, you break down the population into percentages, just rough estimates that are directionally correct, if not exact. Will you tell me what those are again?
Sure, I was trying to, for myself, just to get the numbers, just to try to really, for myself, get a conceptualized, tangible idea of what it was. And so I basically did some internet searches, not just AI type searches, but actual websites to try to figure out how many are there, how many people are employed by the government, how many of them are what I would consider the bullies. And what I came up with was 9–10% of the population are employed by the government, have some government role, their name is on a government paycheck. And of them, most of them are what we would call clerks. They are IT staff, cleaning crew, accountants, legal people. They're just people who do jobs in offices or whatever. And the people who count, what the people I call the bullies, are really the politicians and law enforcement, military. The reason I separate them from the rest of the population of government employees is because they are the ones to whom the myth of authority applies. When we think of people believing the myth, how does that translate to human beings for whom they believe the myth? Well, politicians for sure, because people believe that we are supposed to be beholden to the politicians. We're supposed to obey them. When they make laws and rules, we are obligated to follow them. That's the myth, which means it applies to the politicians, the people who make the laws. Who else? The enforcers. More or less, we're expected to obey the armed authority. So if a cop stops you on the street, well, actually, if the cop flashes his lights while you're driving, you are expected to stop. Now, if there was I don't know, some thug driving a car near you and he put a light on his car and he drove past you and he's signaling for you to stop, you're probably not going to stop. You don't feel the obligation to obey him. There's no myth of authority there. But with a cop, you do it. Okay, then. For an enforcer, the myth applies. But when the DMV clerk says, here, sign this paper and pay me $10 for your license, you pay it because you know you have to, but that's a little bit more transactional. You're not doing it because you are morally obligated to that clerk. You don't look at them as someone you're supposed to bow to. So when we make this simple separation of clerks versus bullies, I think it's reasonable to classify the enforcers, meaning the people with the guns, trained and armed, and the politicians as the one the myth seems to apply to. Military, to be perfectly honest, Shepard, I'm not so sure anymore that the military counts in there. They are armed. But when I think about how the myth applies, I don't know that we feel moral deference to the military.
Hmm.
I think there's a little of that, but it's not complete because I don't see them as the ones here enforcing domestic laws. So I'm actually not so sure they count in that numbering scheme, but I've counted them anyway, simply because they are armed and potentially can be used to enforce domestic laws, which has begun to some degree. I believe the Marines have been pulled out very recently for border enforcement. So there you go. They count in that sense. In any case, to answer the question, about 3 million human beings occupy bully positions, politicians and enforcers, and about, I think it was in the 20, 21 million range, are everyone else, the clerks. So that's the basic separation.
So 25 million out of 300 and whatever the United States is at right now.
Right.
Um, that's not much. That's a tiny
No,
dot.
no, it's a tiny dot, and you should link to that. That's a great Larken Rose video.
Yeah.
Um, it's not much. Not only that, it doesn't matter that those 20 million are paid by a government paycheck. They don't count. They are, as I said, clerks. If our myth of authority, the myth we have in our head, doesn't apply to them, then they literally don't count. They're not the ones who are going to be making laws or enforcing laws with a gun along the way. I see the clerks as more like the furniture and tools the state owns. The state has computer terminals, desks, buildings, flags, tanks, uh, uniforms, clerks. They're in that group because they are tools that the state employs to get what it wants done. The clerks themselves see them that way. They see themselves that way. They don't think that they have moral authority over the rest of us. They have a job. They're getting paid. They want their rules enforced. But let's face it, the guy who's doing IT over at some county office, he really doesn't think himself as some kind of moral authority over the rest of them. The politicians, they think that. The cops, when they're stopping us, they think that. But all those other clerks, the accountants, the cleaning crew, the cooks at army bases, they're not thinking that way. They are tools. So because, or at least for me, when I think of them as tools, like the equipment, that depersonifies them as a threat in this entire scheme of an analysis. It is true that DMV clerk holds a little bit of power, and that other DMV clerk and that other county zoning commissioner, yes, they all have power, and they're small bits of power, and collectively it adds up to a lot. But the myth doesn't live there. So I take that 20, 21 million and I essentially lump it in with the rest of us, the majority of people who are victims of the myth, and not the bullies who are actually who we feel beholden to. And that reduces that number down to the 3 million, roughly 3 million human beings who are dominating, in this case, the United States territory. So you have 3 million out of roughly 330 million people, a ratio of about one bully to 110 regular people. That's the myth of authority, and that shows the power of the myth because without that myth, one person could not dominate 110.
Right. It's like we, and when I say we, I mean the loyal subjects of the king, the people, the main 300 and whatever million of us, we are basically holding them up. I loved your analogy of a sheet of glass. It's not a completely analogous, but no analogy is. So I mean, it gets us pretty close. Will you tell us what that is? I love that.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy. If you simply think of the majority as sort of standing in one big crowd and they're holding up a massive, massive sheet of glass, we can think of the myth of authority as that sheet of glass. And they're holding it up, and we could say in this analogy, they're not really aware of it. They just have this myth in their head and they're holding up the sheet of glass. And above that is the bullies of the state. They're skating along on top. They have no problem because this foundation under them, the myth, is rock solid. And up there you have the bullies. And again, I'll emphasize below that includes the clerks of the state because they are just as much victimized by this myth and just as much holding up morally the legitimacy of the state. So above the glass, you have these 3 million bullies. And below, you have these 330, roughly, million people holding it up. Now, right there, you see this disproportion. But this also gives us some clues as to what would happen if the myth started to erode. Because if the myth started to erode, then metaphorically, some of the people below would just remove their hands, they're not holding it up anymore because they don't hold the myth. Now, at the very beginning of that process, the withdrawal of their hands from holding it up is not going to really affect that huge sheet of glass very much. It might create a little microscopic chip in it, but that's about it. And if they're dispersed around, you're not going to really see too many chips. It doesn't change things too much. But with time, as there are more and more chips, as more and more people start to get skeptical of the state and lose that myth or it erodes, the chips start forming a little bit more tangibly. There's a point at which the bullies on top start to notice. They notice, gee, this sheet of glass isn't as structurally sound as it used to be. It's got chips in it. Now, that may not affect them in any way. They may feel like, ah, no problem, it's still solid. I believe that's where we are today. There's a sense that there's skepticism about the state, even by the bullies, but they're not too worried about it. There's just a couple chips here and there. As time passes, chips form into cracks. Cracks form into those terrible, quarter-sized chips you see in your windshield, and you know what's coming after that, right? Now, again, there's some stretching this over time, of course,
Right.
but eventually, what are the bullies above going to think? They're going to tend to think this isn't as stable a situation as I would like. And with time, some of them are going to back off. They're going to jump down. They're going to say, this is not for me anymore. This is making me too uncomfortable. So overall, I came up with that analogy just to illustrate, for one, the disproportion of the people below and above, but also the nature of the myth and how, as the myth erodes, it creates an environment that's less and less and less hospitable for the people above. And their reaction, and this is key, their reaction is to do what people do, which is gravitate to environments that are more welcoming to them and kind of stay away from the ones that are not. And the environment of an eroding myth is likely to become an environment they're not going to want to be in as much. It wouldn't happen all at once, but it would happen over time in a very gradual and organic way.
And this brings us to an area that, as I have studied your material, and I have not watched all 23 episodes, but AI and I have combined some of it. You and I have had some good conversations, and I think I have a bit of a grasp. There's an area, though, that I am not in agreement with, and I want to be. I want you to persuade me. My concern is that if we look at history, and not all history, that doesn't tell you everything. Before the Wright brothers, historically, human beings couldn't get into metal and fly. So I understand that there's new social and physical technology. Having said that, my thought is that there are 3 million people who make a living by keeping that sheet of glass from breaking. And if they look at any one of us standing down below the glass and they say, "Hey, Shepard, I noticed you put your hands down. You need to put them back up or I'm going to shoot you." Then I'm going to put my hands back up because I'm scared of them. And if they had said they're going to come after all of us, well, I know that's not true. But if they start singling out some people, then the rest of us, get scared. I don't think historically states wither up and die when people have contempt for them or distrust them. Maybe my problem is that there has never been a deep philosophical understanding of the myth of authority. And so for the last 6,000 or 30,000 years, whatever your worldview is, that humans have been kind of social critters getting along, doing their things. Maybe this is the first time that's happening, but I find it unreasonably optimistic without evidence to think that we can kind of ignore and James Freeman style harass them into just, yeah, I don't like doing this anymore. It's not a great environment. How, how can I think that that would actually happen? Please persuade me. I want to believe this.
Now, that's a what I have found to be a complicated but interesting aspect of this. And you hit on, I think, two good points about that. So let me address them in two ways. One is the fact that we don't have an example of this. That's exactly right. We don't have any example in human history of an actual case where a culture overcame the myth of authority and the state thereby dissolved away and you had a free society. That's absolutely true. There's a first time for everything, like with the Wright brothers. And in my view, we are experiencing that right now. We are at the cusp and the very baby steps of that event happening. So, no, we don't have an example we can point to, but we can point to many or parallel examples where the psychology that's behind this analysis of the myth of authority does apply. So, let's take two of them. Slavery. There was a time in human history where slavery was bulletproof. In fact, it lasted from, so far as we know, the beginning of humans up until around the mid 1800s, mid to late 1800s, when slavery no longer existed to any degree. So, where in that period was the transition away from slavery to non-slavery? Well, it was roughly, I'm being very, very rough here, 1820 to 1870. We have roughly a 50-year period where if you start at the very beginning of that period, 1820-ish, slavery is bulletproof. It's like it was through all of human history. If you jump ahead to 1870 and thereafter, right up to today, slavery is utterly impermissible in civilized society. Those are two polar opposite perspectives on an entrenched myth-based system. Myth-based because people used to believe that slavery was okay. In 50 years, the entire thing switched. You have a transition from full slavery to virtually no slavery. If at any point along that transition you were to just freeze frame and look at it, whatever it looked like at that point looked perfectly normal. If another point along that 50-year period, look at it, it will have looked perfectly normal. So
Hmm.
at the beginning, it looked perfectly normal. At the end, it looked perfectly normal. At every point in between, it looked perfectly normal. And yet, from beginning to end, you have the opposite condition. That means that a myth eroded during that time, and the outward expression of it, slavery, eroded in kind, but it happened organically. So here we have an example of not a situation where we actually have tangible evidence or tangible examples of a switch. Now, I realize we have the Civil War and we can point to that. We have the Emancipation Proclamation as a legal expression of the end of slavery. That's the political aspect of it. If you look around the world, slavery did not generally end with armed conflict or violence. It withered away. Why? Because whatever this myth was uh, that permitted slavery in the minds of men was withering away, and with it, the tangible expression of it. So to me, the movement away from the myth of actual political authority to free societies is happening and will happening exactly that way in an organic way. The second example is the Soviet Union, which is a political expression of exactly the same thing. And here we do have the myth of, we'll say, the authority of the Soviet Union government entrenched from 1917, whenever it started, right up until like 1988, 1989, right in that frame. Solid myth of Soviet Union political authority, and of course, a solid Soviet Union state. But it started to wither. What was withering? The myth that they had legitimacy. People, the administrators, the bureaucrats, the military, many of the actual politicians were starting to doubt that the Soviet Union had legitimacy. That was an erosion of the myth of authority. Granted, targeted only to the Soviet Union style of government, nonetheless, an erosion of the myth. Within several years, the Soviet Union government vanished. It fell over. quietly and with relatively peacefully. That's an example of how a government can dissolve simply because the myth of its legitimacy dissolves. Now, of course, they replaced it with the Polish government, right? The Hungarian government, the Georgian government. So the myth of general political authority did not dissolve. But if we're looking for examples of how the psychology of the myth dissolves, the Soviet Union can't give us much of a better example because we had this entrenched institution that none of us who are old enough ever would have believed it would have disappeared. And yet it did. It dissolved. So that's the best examples I think we can come up with in reality.
Interesting, interesting. That gives me so much to noodle on, and it sounds good, but I'm not real bright, so it takes me some time to mull things over
I
and come up with
disagree.
some
You are right.
come up with some conclusions. That is interesting. That's a very positive way of looking at things.
I was going to say that I want to make clear also, because this is a good opportunity to express it, slavery, Soviet Union, and now the myth of authority itself. The role of the majority, the role of the majority in this, to me, is critical and is one of the insights that popped into my head when I was doing this analysis. The libertarians are very schizophrenic when it comes to the majority. On the one hand, the majority are self-governable people who deserve freedom and deserve, to not have their consent violated. And then on the other hand, the majority are just too stupid to get our ideas. They're dumb. Now, I don't know how you can actually hold those two in your head at the same time. The way I resolve this is that the majority accept generally, passively, the cultural beliefs and norms that they grow up with. I think that's kind of a given. That's not even a judgment. It's just the way things are. If they're brought up with a myth of political authority, that's what they're going to believe their whole lives. That's what gives the state the ability to persist, is this massive number of people who believe the myth, express the myth in their behaviors, and ultimately fund and support the state. But in a transition, go ahead, you want to
No,
say
no, go
something.
ahead. No, continue.
In a transition, what we have a growing skepticism of the state. Now, it doesn't mean we're talking about a growing number of new voluntarists. That's always great, and I love when that happens. But let's face it, that's not really the way it plays out. Instead, people see news items that are reaching a tipping point for them where they say, you know what, this is all BS. These politicians are just a bunch of crooks. Those are little nuggets of skepticism that flower and bloom among hundreds of millions of people over a course of time. I use the analogy of a bucket of skepticism. The bucket starts empty practically when there's no skepticism of the state and everyone is fully on board. I love the state and I vote and all this stuff. As more people get skeptical, that adds a little thimbleful of water to the bucket. Another person's skeptical, another thimbleful. A person becomes a voluntarist. Oh, a whole cupful because they are fully over the myth. All these little thimblefuls and sometimes cupfuls of skepticism starts to fill up the bucket. And there's a tipping point at which the bucket overflows. And metaphorically, I mean by that, there's a tipping point where there's enough of this totality of skepticism across the whole, let's say, United States, whatever culture you want to name, to where their behaviors have withdrawn the general support of the state, where they don't show anymore as much that they support the state because they don't believe that anymore. It's a totality of behaviors. What used to be a welcoming environment because of these behaviors, a welcoming environment for the bullies, has become a notch less inviting, a little bit less attractive. And their response in kind is to notice that this environment is slightly less attractive. And as the sheet of glass analogy shows, eventually it's cracking glass to where they really don't want to be in that environment anymore. So the reason I bring this up is to stress the importance of the majority as playing a role in this process, even though it's a passive role.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I think in this first part, we have nicely covered the essentially the podcast series. There are a few more questions that I have that I would like to get into after the break. But just for now, where could people learn more about this if they want to dig a little bit more deeply into it?
Sure, sure. All you need to do is just go right to my YouTube channel, which is the White Pillbox, or my Substack, which is markmaresca.substack.com. And all my content is on both of those platforms, and that's where you'll be able to read up on it or watch it.
Wonderful. And I will put links below. And then, just so everybody knows, for this next part, we are going to hone in a little bit more on a few more questions I have about this foundation. And then we're also going to freeform and chat about a lot of other things, just little bits here and there. I would encourage you, if this is all you're going to listen to of this video, because you wanted the basic concept, if you have some good arguments, having spoken with Mark in the past, he truly wants to hear them and improve his ideas and his understanding of the world. So please write them in the comments. And I assume, Mark, I haven't asked you this yet, but we'll give it a little bit of time. Would you be willing to come back on and we can kind of address any questions that we see below? Would you be up for that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I would love to do that, Shepard.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Mark, and we'll be back in just a bit and continue the conversation.
Thank you, Shepard, as well.
Ever dreamt of driving a car that merges freedom with exhilaration? Meet the 2024 Porsche 911. This isn't just a car, it's a tribute to 60 years of automotive excellence. Imagine the roar of its engine and the thrill of navigating through winding roads with racetrack precision. The 2024 Porsche 911, especially the limited production ST model, offers a visceral, unfiltered driving experience. It's more than a car. It's a celebration of liberty and sensory pleasure, designed for those who cherish the roar of the engine and the freedom of the drive. Drive the 2024 Porsche 911 and experience liberty on wheels. Well, welcome back from the break. We're going to move our conversation now a bit, and I'm going to try to give Mark a little bit of pushback, possibly some of the questions you might have. Something that I really liked that you've been talking about is the environmental feedback and how that makes the people holding up the sheet of glass, as they give bad signals and as they make it miserable, the people on top don't want to rule as much. This makes me wonder, what is your call to action? Let's say everybody who's watched part one says, all right, Mark, we voluntarily want you to lead us. Tell us what to do. Give us our marching orders. What do we go forth and do? What do we have to do to make this happen?
Okay, so first, I would clarify a little bit on the beginning part of that expression of it. Um, when I think of the environment, I think of it as, first of all, starting off as it is more or less today and has been through history, meaning the myth of authority is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, it's in everyone's head. I realize there's a few notable exceptions, but for the most part, everyone believes the myth. This manifests itself in human behavior, behaviors that show that people want to be ruled. Obviously, if they have the myth, they're going to express it in words and actions, like there ought to be a law, or the president ought to do something about that. My city council ought to do something. Their actions are voting. Their actions are saluting the flag and singing anthems, and so on. These actions collectively create this environment, what I call a welcoming, hospitable environment for the power seekers. And along the power seekers come, you have the state. That, in a nutshell, is the cause and effect relationship between the myth and the state. And it holds through all of history, obviously. In the transition, we have an organic eroding of the myth, starting off small, but people becoming skeptical. As I said, that small bucket of skepticism starting to fill up. That alters the environment. I would not express it as being more defiant of the government. I would call it withdrawing the belief and thereby withdrawing the actions that reflect the belief. So all that really means is less expressions that say there ought to be a law, less saluting the flag, hopefully less voting. Collectively, just a slight reduction at the beginning of people's expressions. If their expressions are less, the general environment is a tad less conducive and less welcoming. So it isn't a defiance, it's more of just a erosion of this belief. Now, it doesn't mean defiance has no role in there. There are going to be those of us, not me to be honest, who are brave enough, say like James Freeman is, to actually argue with a cop at a stop or argue with a city council member or whatever it is. Most people are really not like that. They don't want to take actions. And I don't think it acts out or plays out that way. They simply have less of this belief in the myth, a little more skepticism. That's it. That alone, I'm claiming, when I say alone, that is the bulk of the dynamics that causes the bullies, the people on top of that sheet of glass, to just have more and more of a sense that this environment is less welcoming. So that helps me better answer the question of the call to action. The call to action has to be individual. I don't believe that a specific plan or call to action is going to significantly increase that skepticism. I think it's going to be organic and will take on its own dynamic in its own time. It doesn't mean that I would want to see libertarians stop trying to message. Not at all. I'm glad that somebody messaged to me 40, 50 years ago because that's what made me open my eyes. So if I were to have a call to action, it would be keep communicating, keep trying to help undermine the myth of authority in people's minds, but with the psychological goal, let's say, of being individual about it. Hope that you'll change one person's mind, two people's minds in your whole life. Be modest and realistic about what you will achieve. Don't think about the libertarian movement or any of this messaging as altering this dynamic so much that it's going to give us a free society. It's too grand and unrealistic, in my opinion, of a goal. The call to action, if there is any, is to message so that you help others wake up. And if not wake up, get a little more skepticism. I'll think of an example of this, but the one that I'm thinking of hasn't come to mind yet, but it'll get back to me. But that's my short answer to that.
Okay. A concern I have is that as an entrepreneur, when I think about a new business, it can't just be a good idea. I have a friend who's a very conservative Lutheran minister, and he has this great idea that everybody in the world should believe this one and only truth that he knows. And so he's got his idea, he's got that down pat, but there are 7 or 8 billion people who have zero interest in hearing his sales pitch, and I'm one of them. So when I look at the message that I want to give to people, I worry that people are too disinterested, and that's much kinder than saying that 50% of people are in the bottom half IQ wise in the world. But I do believe that that's the case. And I was listening to True Believers by Eric Hoff yesterday, and he made a great quote about how most people, and he didn't give a percentage, but I'm going to say 80 or 90%, don't really want to be free. They want the freedom to not have to be free. They want somebody else to make their decisions for them. It's easier to say, I don't want to take, not to say, but to not take individual responsibility and say, well, the reason I'm poor right now is because the government has a horrible system in place and I need to vote harder, but it doesn't really matter. It's not me, it's everybody. I'm not responsible for this. Whereas the individualist, the critical thinker, the voluntarist, the anarchist says, well, no, it's up to me to create the environment I want, to see what's around, and then go fix it, go build it to be what I want. We are few. And I worry that even though we sow some seeds of contempt and discontent and such in the minds of the mindless masses, that maybe that won't be enough. Am I being too pessimistic here? Do I need a whiter pill?
I would shift the perspective of that. I would say that it's assuming that the ideas that we have, the ideas of liberty and freedom and consensual relationships among people, private property, non-aggression, that those are ideas that have to get out into the masses in order for there to be change. That's a presupposition. Now, in terms of the scholarly perspective of that, meaning I believe in non-aggression because I went ahead and read a lot of books on it, or I read Mises on economics, and that has persuaded me that these ideas are sound. If only we could get everybody to do that. No, that's not going to happen. That's not how things change. People don't have that kind of immersive interest that we may have. For us, it's almost a hobby that we're really enthusiastic about. The free society doesn't come along by having a lot of people be just like us. Instead, we want people to be exactly the way they are right now. I don't want people to change fundamentally at all. Now, do I like that a lot of them might, I don't know, spend too much time on TikTok? To me, that might not be the healthiest thing. I don't care about that. That has nothing to do with this psychological analysis. This has everything to do with how people are fundamentally at the root. Everybody is a voluntarist already in their private life. That person who gets up in the morning and dresses themselves does not want the government telling them how to dress. When they decide what to eat, they do not want the government or anyone else telling them what to eat. They do not want the government or anyone else telling them where they may work, who they may associate with, what kind of entertainment to consume, who to marry, what religion to follow, whether to follow a religion. You can go on and on and on, and you can see quite plainly that in people's private, immediate lives, they are anarchists. They do not want a moral authority telling them what to do. Obviously, if you expand or extend that to say, what do you think ought to be done about there being fewer fish in the fisheries? That's where their indoctrination will come in. That's where the propaganda will have done its job by making their false self say, the government ought to do something about that. Put that aside. Stick with their private lives, which occupies probably 95% of their time. They are anarchists. So we don't have to persuade anybody to be exactly who they are already. All we have to do, and by the way, I credit Larken Rose to this insight, all we have to do, if we have to do anything, is introduce their true self to their false self. Make their mind see that they've made an exception when it comes to governance for the state. Help them to see that if you're consistent, you will look at the state as just another bully, and that should not be tolerated. Now, I don't have any illusions that the masses are even going to agree with that. That's why I believe that all we need to do is try to increase that skepticism a little bit. Is that our job? And will a free society not happen unless we do that? No. In my genuine opinion, if we stopped all libertarian messaging right now, a free society is still a few decades, perhaps 50 years ahead of us, whether we do it or not. I'm not discounting the libertarian scholarly work, the principles, the philosophies. No, absolutely. That started in the 70s, big time, and it continues to this day. And I want and hope that to continue. But the messaging, I'm more and more convinced it plays no real role. So, like I said before, if we're going to do it, it will be to help specific people just get a little more skeptical.
Okay. That's boy, is that an easy set of marching orders. Yeah, you don't really have to do anything, but if you choose to, just share the good word of stuff you know with people, and that can be your taste in the best Indian curry sauce to get for your chicken, or it can be about liberty, but whatever, just kind of live a good life and yeah, don't worry about it. It's going to work out. That's kind of a comforting thing to think about.
Yeah,
Thank you.
and it's not meant to be indifferent either. You know, I'm not indifferent, and even though I'm saying that I'm not convinced that our specific efforts are going to change society or trigger that, doesn't mean I stop. Again, because as I said before, I'm appreciative of the people who I happen to meet at the right age, at the right time in my life that helped me wake up. And so if I know that in the end, I managed to get three, four, five people a little more skeptical, that for me, the effort is worth it. If others feel the effort is not worth it, then that's fine too.
I do think it's so interesting this nature that many of us have to do something. About a week ago, I finished reading an awesome book, The Machiavellians by James Burnham, and it's an old book. But I had always just thought Machiavelli, well, wasn't he part of that evil triad or whatever? So everything's bad. But as it turns out, Machiavellians basically say, no, we just examine how things are. We don't have an opinion if they're good or not. This is just how they are. And they kind of some of the Machiavellian thinkers have talked about how humans feel this need to do something, even if they don't know what it is or what it will accomplish or how to do it. They just feel they need to go do something. And I have that too. Thus, my YouTube channel, thus, my writing, thus, I would suspect your YouTube channel and your Substack. There's this intrinsic thing to say, hey, brothers and sisters, neighbors near and far, here's what we think. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that's a good thing because that means that what we believe and feel and study and come to understand in our heads translates in the real world into human action and efforts. And it's experimental. You try something, it may or may not work. It needs to be tweaked. It utterly fails. It does work. Any imaginable outcome is possible from that. And so I think that's part of our nature is to act and to try to make things better in our lives. That's what we're doing all the time when we work, when we eat, when we socialize. So that I think is probably an extension of that, this effort to have a grander result in what we do so that we can make the world better. When we volunteers, let's say, at a food bank or whatever it is, we're trying to make things better in our little modest way. Politics, this whole idea of statism, sort of leverages that in a way. It tries to take that inclination and give us the illusion that there are structures we can put in place, in this case, political, that can accomplish that sense of call to action, but achieve amazing, great, grand things, change the world for the better. So it's an unrealistic, I think, extension of this natural inclination to simply act and make things better by deluding ourselves into thinking that, well, we can just extend that to a grander scale. The way we do it, of course, is to empower a certain ruling class of people with the power to coerce everybody else into forcing this grand plan down our throats. And I do think that we, as in this libertarian movement, kind of fell victim to that thinking, well, we'll do the opposite. We'll be the spearhead of the movement to dismantle the state. Once again, a grand plan. But things like that don't work out because it would always require enough of a broad social buy-in so that all the people sort of all do this one big thing. Look at history, and it really, really rarely works out that way, where everybody agrees to one big plan, enough so that that plan actually gets implemented. It like literally never seems to happen that way. And yet we are always in this mindset that that we can actually make it happen that way. I just think that's probably just a failure of our assumed thinking.
Yeah. Something that I struggle with that kind of ties into this is that I want to help certain libertarians. So I use that with a small L, or people who are even liberty leaning. So the Free Ross movement, for example, or another friend of mine whose father was imprisoned for 30 years for selling some drugs, 30 years ago, and who's now an old guy who should be free. And then Roger Ver, what he's going through, his persecution. And so every so often I'll get an email of, hey, petition the government, please. And I said, well, no, I can't. I'm a voluntarist. That's the difference between a voluntarist and anarcho capitalist. Voluntarists don't participate in the political system at all. We completely withdraw from it because any participation, even signing something saying, hey, King, pretty please don't put Roger in prison, that is legitimizing the existence of a king. And I'm not sure how to look at that. If I'm simply saying, hey, King, I don't want you to do this, I'm not directly harming anyone. How do you kind of fall on all of this?
Yeah, those when complicated issues like that arise, I try to fall back on principle. And in my case, since I'm a voluntarist, I believe that there is no justification for creating innocent victims, for violating the consent of people over their body and their tangible property. You can't justify that. Because if you try to justify that, make an exception for it, well, you've just stepped out of the civilized discussion and you've basically said might makes right. So for me, the principle is the foundation of how I would attack any given situation. So in the case of Ross, let's say, for example, freeing Ross would have meant that one has to, or the likely prospect of seeing Ross freed would have meant showing support for Donald Trump in the last election because Donald Trump pledged to free Ross if he got elected. And that's certainly a very attractive outcome because we wanted to see Ross freed. But along with supporting Trump would come the endorsement of anything he does besides freeing Ross. Any laws he made, any influence he had, any wars he started, any new victims. So a decision on how I would fall on any particular issue would have to ask the question, despite any good that you may see coming out of whatever it is you're proposing, will there be new innocent victims? Because if so, you can't really justify the good that you claim to come out of it. That's very hard to say when we think of the specific example of Ross, because Ross is a free man right now because Donald Trump got elected as president. Just saying those words sounds like, how can you have done anything else but endorse Trump? But Trump, just as one example, right now seems very close to starting a war with Iran. Now, there's going to be innocent victims if there haven't been already. Just that one example. We're not even talking about other things he may have done up till now. So the question would be on principle, would you endorse, if you could go back in time, would you endorse Trump? If you knew that he's going to create other innocent victims, but free Ross. Oh, it's so hard to weigh in on that. But if principle guides you, you'd have to say, I can't endorse him because he's going to create new innocent victims, knowing that one person will still continue to be victimized. That's a tough one, but principle is all we have to guide us through these things, unless we just go off emotion. So that's the general guideline I would use. And that is why I end up a voluntarist, because there is no case where endorsing a government policy or a person is justified because you don't know how that policy or person might eventually create innocent victims. And if you don't know that, it is irresponsible to endorse a policy or endorse a person because you become complicit in that. And that's the reason I personally don't participate in politics or even endorse policies.
So using that measure, that test, then I would say that, and I agree with this, that voting for the Donald in an election is not an appropriate thing for a principled voluntarist to do. However, sending a card to him once he's been elected saying, my preference is that you free or don't prosecute Roger Ver. That would be acceptable because me sending him that card or signing a joint petition is not creating any new victims, whereas encouraging him to be hired in the first place will. Do I have that right?
Right. On principle, if you are quite reasonably sure that you're not going to create new victims, that would probably not violate that principle. The flip side of that, though, is it going to accomplish the end you seek? Is your petition going to matter? That seems highly unlikely. So this is really moved from the principled side then to the pragmatic side. So if you say step one is measure it against principle and it doesn't violate or doesn't anticipate new innocent victims, then okay, what you choose to do with your time is up to you. But then that second layer would kick in is what's the point? What's the point of what you're doing? Do you expect Roger to be, to not be prosecuted? Well, it doesn't seem like it's going to help. So you can spend your time on that or not. What I would, the examples that would be more tangible would be more of these local government type of examples of participation. So would you go to a council meeting, say, with your in your local county, where if you speak up and you take certain actions, there is a tangible chance that you will get a permit fee reduced or a tax reduced. Well, if you can't identify any new victims that come out of that, and if you are actually going to help people be less victimized, then you can see an argument for doing that. Me personally, I've never done anything like that because even though that's easy to describe, a local tangible example, they really don't pop up all that often, or they do create innocent victims in tangential ways if you think it through. And that's where thinking in principle is so important because you can easily convince yourself that, well, there won't be new victims in this particular policy. So the good that comes out of it is justified. Not really, especially if your actions are endorsing the system. And you really touched on this earlier on. And that's always for me a very strong motivator. Are my public actions lending credence and giving more weight to the myth of authority? And in participating, you're always doing that. So to me, that's one of the big dampers on why I would participate, even if I might expect that there could be some good come out of it.
Yes. And that is kind of where I come down when I think about sending that card that simply says on, I'm sending this to Donald, and I say, I don't want you to persecute or prosecute Roger Ver. And then I sign my name at the bottom. What is being said to Trump and the government that isn't written? Well, part of it is, oh, good, Shepard sees me as someone who needs to be spoken to and recognized. He's reached out to me versus just not doing it at all. He's legitimizing my office. He's legitimizing the fact that the government has the physical ability to do things and probably the moral ability. Good. Shepard is one of our subjects. Let me make a note of that. Okay, now what does he say? Not like they care what we say, but that unspoken communication, uh, essentially legitimizing the system, that is such a long-term, hard to see, lost in the weeds harm that it's sometimes easy to forget, I think.
Mhm. Yes, it very much is. And that's what makes it hard to stick to it because you don't see the advantage that it has. And that's what I believe to be the failure of the majority of libertarian messengers out there that we've seen all these years, even to this very day. Even the spokespeople who are really good at explaining stuff, when they get lost in those policy weeds, oh my God, all I see them doing is endorsing the system because they are endorsing the system and they are using this platform now of not just making people more rigid in their belief of the myth of authority, but they're also tainting the name of libertarian. They're tainting the voluntarist concept by associating it with politics. And so once again, now all they've done is, I think, make it more of an uphill struggle.
Yes, yes, I agree. Well, as we're drawing to an end here, I would love it if you would share with me. We still have a couple minutes. What haven't I asked you that is important, or what hasn't come out so far in our conversation, either about the myth of authority or just in general, that you would like to share with the world?
Um, I I'm still working on refining how I can present the Myth of Authority series in a more compact form. Uh, I still think 23 episodes that are roughly a half hour each are important, but they're probably slightly more important for the person who's somewhat new to this or not sure yet or early on in their thinking because it builds the case very systematically. It extracts the insights very slowly and carefully and systematically. And I also don't think it would harm any of our fellow travelers to get the whole picture. But it's a big commitment. And because of that, I am trying to come up with ways where I can compact it down. Um, and I'll hopefully in a few months be able to have something like that. But the general thread that I would want people to take from it is that the myth of authority leads to the state as a causal factor. It is the it plays an essential and the essential causal role in the state in a very step-by-step way, which comes out in the series. That connection is the thread that shows itself through the entire set of insights and white pills that emerge from that simple beginning of the cause and effect relationship. The reason it does that is because it forces us to identify the who, what, where, and how of a transition to a free society. We normally don't think in those terms. We normally think of this hoped for transition to an eventual stateless society as a sort of a vague image of somehow transitioning, somehow, some way. Think about that. Somehow, some way. It's not very precise, especially for nerdy thinkers like us who usually take pride in being very specific. No, you don't see much defining of terms, determining what the nature of the players are, how many there are, what the psychological dynamics. You don't see this happening. In this series, I took the idea of the cause and effect relationship, myth to state, broke it down into the who, what, where, how, so that and when, so that we can actually understand why the insights make sense. So that's the takeaway. That's my sort of sales pitch on why it could be really helpful to try to make the effort to get through this. That might add more people to the list of people who have seen it and who can give me feedback on even better ways of presenting it or refining the thoughts. So my call to action, so to speak, would be try to listen to it, not because it boosts my self or my image out there. No, it's so that we can beat this up, so that we can really see if it makes sense. And if it does, to the extent it does, to get fellow travelers to understand it so they can at least refine their strategies and make them more efficient.
Wonderful. And I'll repeat what I said before the break. Anyone who does have feedback, who's willing to write it in the comments down below, absolutely appreciated, and it will be addressed. And by the way, Mark's content is not for the newbie to moral philosophy. It is not for the brand new person for the most part. Mark's focus is more on the critical thinker who is always already thought through moral philosophy and has arrived at what I think Mark and I agree are almost inevitable conclusions, which are, hey, folks ought to be free and ought not hurt each other and initiate violence against each other. Um, and so his content is good for the person who has already been there and done that and needs a little bit of encouragement. Thus the name, The White Pill. Not everything is bad and horrible, and we don't have to cry and go crawl under a rock. It's going to work out. Let's keep being good and making stuff happen.
Well, talking about white pills, two of my subscribers have communicated to me and have given me positive feedback on the series. And when I asked them where they stood before this, turns out they were newbies.
Ah,
Turns
interesting.
out they were newbies. So what I thought of as, just like you just said, as a series that was really just for the red pilled or nearly red pilled, apparently has gotten a few people to start to just think. So maybe that just confirms that there's certain validity here to the idea of even a little bit of thimbleful of skepticism helps, because
Yes.
it seems to have triggered some thinking in some people's minds. Are they full-on anarchists or voluntarists? No, but it's gotten them to thinking. So I may even have to expand on how I think of the series in those terms as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for doing the series. Thank you for being you. Thank you for chatting with me today. And I'll look forward to a follow-up chat with the questions that are posted below.
I will as well. Thank you so much, Shepard. Thank you for giving me the time.